So I would make sure.
All right, if everyone will take their seat, we'll get ready to start with the special called board meeting. And I will go ahead and call the meeting to order, and I want to welcome everyone to the to this specially called board meeting. Today we're going to be adopting our agency strategic plan and our legislative agenda for the 85th Texas Legislature. And once again, as a reminder, we are all being broadcast, so at any point you may be broadcast across the internet. So be ready for that and be prepared. Also, as David had mentioned, make sure that our phones, now that we've all had a chance to check them and get back in touch, are back on silence, and we'll be able to be uninterrupted. Agenda item number 2 is public testimony, and so far we have no one signed up for public testimony. So we will move on to agenda item 3, which is a consideration of adopting the staff recommendations relating to the agency strategic plan for fiscal year 2017 through 2021. We have with us today Linda Battles, the Deputy Commissioner for the Agency Operations and Communications, Chief Operating Officer, who will present a summary of the strategic plan and all that goes with that. So Linda, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, members. Today, I will be presenting on the agency strategic plan for fiscal years 2017 to 2021. Since 1991, all state agencies have been statutorily required to submit a 5-year strategic plan, and we're supposed to submit this to the Legislative Budget Board and the Governor's Office, and we go through this process every 2 years. So, just to give you an idea of what the timeline has been, the instructions that were issued jointly by the Governor's Office and the LBB came in April of 2016 of this year. But in anticipation of that, we started the internal strategic planning process earlier. So you'll see in November, we actually started the process. We met with the executive officers to identify our agency operational goals, and then each division and department underwent its own strategic planning process to come up with their own mission statements, their goals for their division and department, and action items for achieving those goals. And they had the overall agency goals to align with. So I thought this was a very productive and very beneficial exercise for us internally, and each of those divisions and departments have their own action plans for how they're going to achieve their own goals and then ultimately up to the agency-wide goals. So that's something that you don't see here, that work that's been already done, so I just wanted to take an opportunity to acknowledge that work and to commend all of the staff across the agency, because that work certainly did inform our agency strategic plan. So we sent you a draft plan on June 15th that was sent to you electronically for your review, and on June 16th, which is not indicated on here, we had a briefing with our governmental relations representatives from the institutions, and we encouraged them to review the plan and provide any comments that they may, specifically on a section related to the identification of impediments and redundancies, and to let us know if they had any input, and we didn't receive any comments. So today you'll be considering the plan, and tomorrow we will be submitting it to the Legislative Budget Board and the Governor's Office. You may recall, Dr. Tischer, that our original deadline was June 24th, and we are very appreciative to those offices for extending the deadline so that we could have this meeting today. So the agency strategic plan has 2 primary components. Of course, the first is the strategic plan itself, and it includes the agency mission, operational goals, action items for achieving those goals by August 31st of 2021, and then this new item here on redundancies and impediments. I have to commend the Governor's Office for taking a fresh look at this process, because they really came up with much more streamlined ways of developing the strategic plan, and they specified in their instructions that our strategic plan shouldn't be more than 20 pages. So ours came in at 16, so very, very pleased with that. Also, the other component is the supplemental schedules. So you'll see them listed there, and they're statutorily required reports that have always traditionally been part of the strategic planning process. So that was the section that was over 550 pages long in the materials that we emailed to you on June 15th. Some of these we'd already submitted because of earlier deadlines, such as the report on customer service. And so we've also submitted the proposed budget structure. What we did with the proposed budget structure was this is the structure that we have in the General Appropriations Act for our appropriations every 2 years. And over the last several years, we've had a structure that really reflected closing the gaps, which was our previous higher education plan. So we looked at that from a fresh perspective under the 60 by 30 text higher education plan, and we tried to align those that budget structure with that, as well as taking into account the recent reorganization here at the agency that we underwent in October of 2014. So we also tried to recommend some performance measures and definitions that were more closely aligned with our 60 by 30 text goals. We also tried to propose new performance measures that would measure the work that we actually do here at the agency. And because 60 by 30 is really working, the institutions are the ones that are working towards achieving those goals. Of course, we have some role in that, but we were trying to get really to specifics of our agency operations and how we can measure our own performance. And then we also recommended elimination of several performance measures. We currently have over 100 performance measures, and as David Gardner usually says, when you have too many, you basically have none, because nobody pays attention to them. So we do have key performance measures and non-key performance measures. We've attempted to recommend those, eliminating some of them, but recognizing that we still collect the data. We could run those calculations if asked by a legislator, but we wouldn't have to report on them on a quarterly basis and annual basis. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the supplemental schedules on my presentation today, so I'm going to just focus on our strategic plan. So on the next 5 slides, I'm going to be going through each of our goals, and I'm going to highlight some of the key action items for achieving those goals. Oh, well, first I'm going to cover the agency mission. I apologize for that. Here you'll see the mission statement for the agency, and what's in red is what's actually been revised since you last looked at this 2 years ago. And you'll recall at the April Agency Operations Committee meeting, Dr. Tischer suggested that we include the word coordination in our mission statement, given that that's one of our primary functions here at the coordinating board. So we did that. We put in that the coordinating board is to provide leadership and coordination for the Texas higher education system. We also eliminated the reference to closing the gaps by 2015, and we substituted 60 by 30 texts.
So are those the only 2 changes?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I mean, I love it, and thank you, David, for the recommendation to add the coordination part. I think that really sets the tone, and it is, and yet it wasn't there,
Right.
and now it is, and
Yes.
that's a really good thing.
Yes, thank you. As part of the Governor's Office and LBB's instructions to the state agencies on developing the strategic plan, they included 5 statewide objectives that they directed state agencies to align our agency operational goals with. And you'll see here on the left side is the statewide objectives, and then on the right side are our agency operational goals. Even though we started this process before the instructions came out, I was very pleased to see that our agency operational goals that we had identified in the winter really nicely aligned with the statewide objectives. And the only thing that we really changed was we tweaked some of the wording a little bit, but and we also rearranged the order. You'll recall at the Agency Operations Committee meeting in April, Ms. Shepard suggested that we reorder our goals to align with the statewide objectives. We did confirm from the LBB that they weren't in any kind of prioritization, But we thought that was a really good suggestion so that you can just see how they directly align as you go through. And we had exactly 5 agency goals that we had identified as well. So now, over the next 5 slides, I'm going to go through each of these operational goals and highlight some of the key action items. So our first goal is to provide effective stewardship of taxpayer dollars. The coordinating board is responsible for a biennial budget of $1.8 billion in all funds. And approximately 98% of these funds actually are trusteed to the coordinating board. And what that means is the legislature appropriates the funding to the coordinating board, and then we turn around and allocate the funds to students, to institutions of higher education, and other eligible recipients and entities. In our most recent sunset review, the Sunset Commission had recommended that the legislature establish a risk-based compliance monitoring function to help us monitor those funds, particularly the state financial aid program funds, which comprise most of our budget, as well as verification of the data that are used to formulate the funding formulas. And so we created that compliance monitoring function shortly after the 2013 session with funding from the legislature. And so we currently have Mark Pale, who's our director of compliance monitoring and internal audit, and he oversees an FTE of 4 staff to actually do the auditing of the institutions. They go out, do site visits, they do desk visits as well. And they verify that the institutions are complying with our rules and statutory regulations on how to use the funds, specifically the financial aid funds. And then they also verify that the data are correct. And so we also have 2 FTE in that office that are solely dedicated to internal audits. So they want to make sure, we want to make sure that we're doing everything that we need to be doing to comply with state laws and regulations and so forth. So from all accounts, that function is really effective, and I think that they've provided a lot of value added and security for the board to know that these funds are being used. And we are providing effective stewardship of those taxpayer dollars. One thing that we need to do is require risk management training of all employees. You'll see that as bullet number 2. Last year, the commissioner, David Gardner, Bill Franz, Mark Pale, and I conducted risk management training for key staff across the agency. Now we need to really formalize that risk management policy and make sure that the training is given to all new hires within 30 days of hiring, and we also want to continue that every 2 years for all employees. So we're working on formalizing that. We want to make it electronically available to our employees, and so that's what we'll be working on over the next year or so.
Linda, can I ask a question on that?
Yes.
Is it risk management training specific to this agency, or is it general risk management training?
It's specific to the agency.
Okay.
Yes.
So wouldn't we want to almost have that as their orientation?
Yes, and that's why it would be required within 30 days of their hire. And to some extent, Bill Franz does some of that in terms of like ethics training and so forth. So we just want to formalize it and make it more robust. The other point that I wanted to make under this goal was that we really need to do a better job of letting the legislature know what we need in terms of our agency operations. We have had, historically, at least I've been here for 16 years, a tendency to prioritize funding for students and for programs. And we've done a really good job operating efficiently, operating this agency efficiently. We unfortunately went for 4 years without infrastructure capital budget. And last session, we were, with your help, able to secure some funding for our IT upgrades. We got some funding for security upgrades at DCS, but not here at the coordinating board. And I think since 2011, we've really suffered some significant reductions in our operations funding that we're getting to a point where we're concerned about continuing to take on more legislative mandates without additional support in terms of staff and the people that we need to get the job done. So I just pull that out because I think you're going to see some of that come out in our legislative appropriations request when we're putting our exceptional item request forward to you for your consideration. Goal 2 is to provide effective and efficient coordination of and planning for higher education in Texas. This is something that you as a board have had many discussions about over the last year, and particularly in the context of our legislative priorities. So I'm not going to spend much time on that here because you're going to hear from John Wyatt on the next agenda item when we talk about our legislative priorities, a little bit more about what we're talking about here. But this is also embedded in the plan. Goal 3 is to fully implement the state's higher education plan 60 by 30 text. As you heard from Ginger Gossman earlier, we are conducting regional workshops to inform and engage our stakeholders on the plan and helping them develop some local strategies to achieve the goals in the plan. As we did with closing the gaps over the last 15 years, internally we will be looking at how we can better align our policies with helping us achieve the goals of 60 by 30 text. We want to come to you at least for every board meeting with at least something about 60 by 30 text, whether it be a data highlight or progress on how we're achieving the goals. And we also, because of the heavy emphasis on workforce, we really need to expand our workforce solutions and expertise in workforce data. And Dr. Julie Eklund, who oversees our strategic planning and funding division, is in the process of hiring a FTE to primarily focus on workforce data. And finally, we have a lot of statewide strategies that are included in 60 by 30 text that we're going to be working with the legislature and institutions to hopefully implement to help us achieve the goals.
How did we come up with the measure progress toward the goals every 5 years? I thought in the past we were measuring that on the previous 15-year strategic plan almost annually.
Well, we look at it annually, but you'll recall in both Closing the Gaps and 60 by 30, we have targets for every 5 years. So while we continue to measure it annually, as you said, and Linda mentioned that you'll hear endless reports on our progress, but we have places where we think we absolutely should be in 5-year increments as a way to measure going forward that we're ahead of the game. You know, what could happen in 5 years? You say we're making greater progress on this than we thought. Should we actually perhaps make our goal more rigorous as we did with participation goal and Closing the Gaps, or should we change this target? For example, Closing the Gaps, we realized that the target for African Americans was really set too low, and we needed to raise it because we were actually, Texas Southern had a large decline in enrollment prior to Closing the Gaps, and once they got back to where they were, we pretty much hit our target, so we made an adjustment upwards.
So is there?
You're correct.
So to that question, there's a specific point or process that who determines, because I remember those goals were readjusted, and y'all explained them to those of us who came on about that time, as far as just what you're saying. So is that at a specific, every 5 years we take an analysis and say, hey, we need to adjust this because of such and such, or?
Part of what we'll be doing annually is actually looking at some of these things. So it's possible that prior to the 5 years, we might suggest that you increase the target, or you guys in looking at it might make that suggestion. You talked about actually the research goal was modified because it was it was originally dollars, total dollars, but we realized because those dollars could change from year to year, that we really needed to talk about the share. The board believed that was important. Plus, we realized that we'd actually hit our numeric target because the feds were so slow in reporting that we'd already hit our 5-year target after 2 years. So there are things like that that we'll do, and so some of that comes from our suggestions, and some of it will come from you're looking at the data and say, well, shouldn't we change this as we go forward?
Goal 4 is to maintain a skilled and knowledgeable agency staff to provide excellent customer service. We currently employ approximately 235 FTE, and as is the case with other state agencies, it's become increasingly difficult to recruit and retain a highly educated, skilled, and diverse workforce, primarily due to low salaries and benefits. And in November of last year, the University of Texas at Austin's Institute for Organizational Excellence issued a survey to our employees, as they did with other state employees. And they wanted to assess the attitudes towards the agency and to identify employee perceptions of the strengths and weaknesses of the agency. We had a 56.8% response rate, so 130 out of 229 who were surveyed. And we did have some areas of weakness, which included pay and also employee development. And so you'll see where we want to, in the plan itself, I didn't put it here, but in the plan itself, we list a lot more action items for us to address some of these concerns that came out in the survey. We want to provide more professional development for our employees. We want to do a basic assessment of where we're at in terms of pay compared to institutions who, a lot of our staff in academic quality and workforce require institutional experience, working with degree programs and so forth. So in that respect, we don't really fit other state agencies. We're very different. We are more aligned with the institutions in terms of the classification of those individuals and the pay scale. We need to do some kind of study that will benchmark what the appropriate salary ranges are for a particular position.
Along those lines, Linda, and I concur with that, but do we track, publish, compare the turnover rate of the staff at the coordinating board?
Yes, we do, and in fact, it's part of the schedule. It's part of the schedules,
Okay.
Supplemental schedules. We have a workforce plan. It was embedded in the 550 pages, and I can, if you have specific questions about that, I can ask Tonya Scaparlanda to come up, and she's our Director of Human Resources.
As far as Goal 4, I concur, it's great. Once again, for me, one of the ultimate measurements of a lot of that is what is the turnover rate of any organization, and then knowing how does that rank for other institutions or other agencies, to kind of compare. And so at some point, I would like to see that.
I will share that with you.
Thanks.
And just to let you know, we are looking at a lot of eligible retired people. And so they're coming up for eligibility to retire, and so we've got to prepare for that. So that's why we have, one thing that the commissioner has been charging us with since he arrived here as commissioner was the importance of succession planning. And so I think all of us are focused on improving our succession planning, make sure, I think Julie Eklund is a really good example of succession planning, and when Susan Brown left, Julie was able to step into that position very well. And there's a lot of other examples. Cross-training is another important thing that we need to do. Yes?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to add to your comments on goal number 4, that I do think that's going to be, it's a great time to seek advisors or some kind of, benchmarking, are we in the 25th or 50th or 75th percentile? A lot of corporations are doing that now, and I think it really provides the validity, especially if we're going to tie it into some of our legislative goals in terms of funding.
Yes,
So
thank you.
I think it's great timing.
Okay. And our fifth and final goal is to communicate data, policy, and effective practices to all our stakeholders in a clear and precise manner. The very first bullet on here is to redesign our website. So one of the number one complaints that we receive from our customer service survey is that our website is terrible. And we admit to that. And we've been trying to get some resources to help us to do a better job with our website. Unfortunately, we've been denied our exceptional item requests related to this for the last several sessions. And but what we're trying to do is now work on this internally with existing resources. We have in external relations John Wyatt has reclassified the FTE that he has there to be a web content manager. And so we're in the process of looking for somebody to come and help us in terms of bringing some more consistency and standards to what actually gets onto our website so that we are more coordinated in our messaging. You know, we have one of the best data systems in the country, and we collect a lot of data. But our weakness is presenting it in a user-friendly way and making sure that our customers are getting the information that they need with 1 or 2 clicks.
When's the last time that the website was redone?
Remember, David? It's been a
When
while.
Casey Kennedy was still here, so that would be.
2008?
Yeah, I think it was about
2008.
2008. And the interesting thing was we had the same feedback about our previous website, and we had a lot of stakeholder input, and then they didn't like it once we did it. So you've got to be very careful. Design is not easy. We followed a lot of what people thought, but collectively it didn't all work well together. And that was on us that we didn't do that better.
The point that I would make as far as why I would think that now the game has changed as far as websites being responsively designed so that whatever, it could be on this phone, it could be on the tablet, it could be on the computer, and if we're really trying to drive utilization, the fact of the matter is the smartphone is the place where the vast majority of people are going. That's the tool that they're using to utilize it. And without it being responsive design, trying to figure it out on this versus a computer is night and day.
Right.
So I would think that some real thought as to the necessity of potentially a redesign in that context would be of a lot of value.
Absolutely.
Another aspect of this in terms of the data is being more attentive to the data you make most accessible. Because we tend to have massive amounts of data, and there's so much on our data site that it's, what people really need to see, and we think they need to see isn't highlighted. We don't think it should go away, but we need to make sure the most important stuff is brought up to the surface, and people can still find the other more, sometimes in the weeds type of data that we know some institutional researchers might want, but other people need the higher level data. And so we actually do have a grant to help us with 60 by 30 text with that end of it from the Gates Foundation.
And we're also redesigning our accountability system. So that should be, you will hear a report from Sid Hutchin on where we're at with that at the July 8th Agency Operations Committee meeting. We're also wanting to focus on how we message some key data points. So I know David Gardner has had this idea for a while, but it's a matter of just getting it done. Having these 2-page policy briefs that take the data that we have and analyze the data and then have some either takeaways or policy recommendations from the data. And so just 2 pages, nothing more, so that it's accessible and digestible by everybody. So we're going to be working on that over the next few years. And then also we want to continue building and strengthening our collaboration and communication with all of our stakeholders. So we currently have put several mechanisms in place, such as briefings, regular briefings with our stakeholders, including governmental relations staff, to go over all of our issues that we are undertaking through the board, as well as other issues that we're working on to foster that communication, make sure that we are no surprises, and make sure that they understand what we're working on and get their feedback on issues that will impact ultimately their institutions and students. We also have regular briefings with legislative offices, and of course the commissioner and board members will visit regularly with our legislators. So we're going to try and build on that foundation and improve it even more.
So Linda, on these 4 bullet points you have here, we had a pretty high level of discussion about management of student debt and predictability of the students to understand how much the implications of borrowing was. And one of the ideas we came up with was an app. I could see that fitting into bullet point number 1, but it's not really a website, or bullet number 4, because they are stakeholders, and so are the parents. So do you think these are broad enough that we could encompass some of those
Actually,
ideas?
if you go back to goal 3, that last bullet, implement statewide strategies, we actually have the strategy for student debt goal, which is a financial aid literacy committee, and that's exactly, that app is what that committee is going to be looking at. So I know it's not, as a bullet, but it is definitely fits under goal 3 in terms of our focus.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about that, and I should say, and staff is also aware in 3 years, and it may be something other than an app, that we need to be aware of changing behavior and what people are doing, but right now it's clearly the app.
I'd put together a work group of current students to design it.
Yeah, internally, we have actually talked about perhaps having a competition, not in this area, not for that particular effort, but in terms of other ways to reach out to students. And there's a lot of talent in the state, and I can see it becoming a class project. We haven't gone forward with something like that, haven't discussed it with the commissioner yet, but we think there is a lot of talent out there around that it would probably also help them with their marketable skills and getting the next job if they were the people who created that. I can say also in our appointment of one of the committees, we're thinking about a representative hoping their company might want to develop an app, and very significant company if we get this person to participate.
Pro bono would be best.
Usually students will work for pizza and beer.
Yeah, true. Okay, that completes our goals. There are more action items in the plan, but I just want to highlight some of the main ones. An excellent addition to the strategic plan by the governor's office has been the evaluation and identification of impediments and redundancies. And this includes all of our services, state statutes, and state rules and regulations that are applicable to our agency that we think make the agency less effective and efficient in achieving our core mission, and are redundant and distract us from our core mission. So what you'll see in your places, we went ahead and provided you a hard copy of the plan as well as this document. And this includes 78 areas in which staff identified as being an impediment or redundancy. In the interest of time, I don't want to go through this whole document, but I can pull out some examples of what we're talking about if you'd like. Otherwise, that completes my presentation. We can move on to legislative priorities.
I've got a question regarding our objective as a Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. I want to know if somebody can tell me, do we have authority to authorize new campuses when one of the institutions tries to bring it, and then the building is already there or whatever, and then they want formula funding for it. Do we have authority to approve it ahead of time? Is that, should we recommend to state legislature that we should, since we are a coordinating board, should we be allowed to at least look into it before they start building these new buildings and campuses?
Actually, that's a great transition to the legislative priorities, because we do have one specifically addressing that, so thank you for asking that.
Can I just make a comment? This might sound, well, maybe a little radical, but I loved, sort of these areas that you identified that, okay, wait a minute, we don't want to do that anymore. Why should we do it? Let's change that. It's not part of our core mission. I guess I couldn't help but think, trying to understand the space utilization facilities, when we don't have any authority over to approve facilities or not, why are we, okay, the legislature asked us to do it, we're required to do it, but is that really a good idea? Anyway, that was just one that seemed like it took a long time and a lot of stuff, and then we got this blowback from institutions, and I'm not even sure, it's like not our fault. I mean, we're just purporting to the legislature, and it just, the whole exercise seemed like, I mean, if Greg Finbus, I call him up and say, hey, look, you look according to this formula, you're utilizing your space wrong. Anyway, so just an example of why I was perplexed on that discussion, but I certainly applaud any effort to streamline what could be unnecessary. And I saw a number of examples in that long report.
I think one could argue that doing that space model evaluation, not sure that there's any other entity in the state or state agency that could conduct that, because this agency takes a statewide perspective, and we're not looking at the interest of one institution or over another, just as Ms. Shepard articulated earlier. So I think that's probably why the coordinating board gets these assignments from the legislature, because they know we are going to be objective, but we're also going to take into account, the concerns and try and be balanced and so forth. So that's really the role and purpose of the coordinating board.
I think you could argue that in one sense, along with the coordination, that we are sort of a state-funded higher ed consulting group who has a lot of experience, knows more than their own system. Typically, in doing many things, staff has to look outside the state to see what's going on. So in some ways it's efficient. Sometimes there may be things we wouldn't always want to do. Some cases we would like to have more expertise to do it, and so we can supplement, as we've done. You'll see in many areas we do that, but there's also a reason why we always will use stakeholders in the process. And while it may not always be satisfactory to them, we make a point of that. In fact, with our sunset, we were actually said we included too many people in some cases, too many committees. So we do have that side where we really do want to listen to that, but still, you could also, aside from consulting, maybe in a sense mediators in the process as well. So I think that's why, but I appreciate the observation.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, just something, we don't have the power, then maybe it's important. It'll be interesting to see during the legislative session, and I'd actually like to know, did they use the thing? And what do they do with it? So anyway, that
So, Linda, I just had a quick question. By the way, this document is very thorough, and I appreciate that because you've also included the description of the estimated cost savings or the other benefits recommended with the change. So it's very helpful to clearly see why you want some of the, or why we as an agency need these changed. But just for my own clarification, what's the process to get these changed? Is it something we do internally? Is it legislative? Can you shed some light for me on that?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I have to give kudos to the LBB and the governor's office for developing the template. So they're the ones that prescribed the template, and then our staff then provided the information. So kudos to our staff for doing that. But yes, if it is a statutory citation here, you'll see it on the first column. If it references statute, then yes, we will require that we go through the legislature with legislation. So what you see in here is all of our legislative recommendations are incorporated in here because we wanted to be consistent to make sure that they were incorporated in this document in case you have members of the legislature looking at this. We included things like, cleaning up the statute, repealing certain provisions that just didn't make any sense anymore or were unfunded programs. So let's clean up the statute. But then we made some substantive changes in there as well. In addition to our legislative recommendations, we have some others that, for example, there's a rider in the appropriations bill that relates to our capital budget. And if we submit an exceptional item request for funding related to a capital budget item and the legislature does not approve that funding request, we are prohibited from using any unexpended funds throughout that biennium, the biennium, in trying to support or fund that particular initiative. And so it's sort of a catch-22. We take a risk in adding it as an exceptional item request, and then if it doesn't get funded, we can't do anything with it for 2 years. So our security upgrades for the agency was one of those in terms of our exceptional item requests that did not get funding. And so now we're faced with, can we identify any unexpended funds to implement those? Well, the answer we fear from LBB would be no because of that rider. So that's an example. So what we're going to do in our LAR, when we go through rider revisions, we will make that recommendation, but ultimately it's up to the legislature and the budget writers to decide what to do.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I need a motion to approve this agenda item.
Move.
A motion and a second. David and Janelle, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Motion passes. Thank you, Linda.
Can I ask a question about that? And maybe it's going to be part of John Wyatt's presentation, but all of these redundancies, inefficiencies, this 78 items here, are we in a position to package those that require statutory language and say, just take this as a single bill?
Oh, as an omnibus bill?
Yeah.
Well, they would have to be along the same subject matter in order to be able to, I think.
Well, they're all under the same subject matter. They all are dealing with the higher ed coordinating board. So, I mean.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things.
I guess what I'm asking is the governor's and the LBB's requirement that we include this list here. I'm assuming they're going to take action. It's not just an exercise in mental math.
We actually met with the governor's office yesterday about these, and they were very pleased that we had identified some efficiencies and redundancies and impediments. So I think they're looking at this very closely. But we aren't technically, obviously, by you adopting the plan, you're endorsing these changes. So we as staff could seek sponsors to push this forward, any or all of these. We're not necessarily including them in our legislative recommendations. We've got different categories and levels of effort and so forth. I mean, there's only so many of us that can kind of carry the changes and work with legislative offices to get it done. But I like your approach that if we could throw them all into one bill, but boy, that would be really risky because you open up the statutes for other changes that could occur that are beyond your control, obviously.
You're going to have to open it up. Why not open it once instead of 78 times?
And we would have to look at, where the limits are in terms of, if you're opening up a specific section of statute, what recommendations do we have that are specific to that section versus another section? The legislature, I don't know where it's defined, but they have limits on how much they're going to let you say this is all related to the same subject matter. But that's something that we could try to work out.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a discussion since the LBB and the governor's office asked for this. Yeah. We owe them a discussion after they had an opportunity to digest this and say, okay, which of these 78 do you recommend adopting, and can we package that, and how are we going to lead that through the legislature.
And this is, as Linda mentioned, this is a new process for this time around. So it'll be very important for us to talk to the LBB and the governor's office of, what is their intention with this? Where do they want us to go with these impediments and redundancies?
Great. Next item is agenda item number 4, consideration of adopting the staff recommendation relating to the coordinating board's legislative agenda for the 85th Texas Legislature. John Wyatt, Director of External Relations, will provide an overview of the staff legislative recommendations and then be, of course, available to answer any questions. So, John, take it away.
Thank you, Chairman. As you know, the staff has been working for some time now to develop and refine legislative recommendations for the 85th Legislature. The legislature will convene in January of next year, but pre-filing of bills begins in November. So we're starting to get pretty close, actually, to the start of the next legislative session. You may recall that we had a discussion at the April board meeting regarding the legislative recommendations, and at that meeting there were kind of two items of feedback that we got as the staff. The first was to put some sort of categorization to these recommendations. We had not indicated any priority previously, but you wanted us to come back with a recommendation for how to categorize these recommendations. And then the other item was regarding our item on coordinating expansion of higher education. You had asked for some more specificity in terms of that recommendation, which is reflected in the documents that you have. In terms of categorizing these recommendations, we actually took a different approach than we've done in previous years. Previously, we indicated tiers of recommendations, and those became indicators of priority. So a tier 1 recommendation was a high priority, tier 2 mid priority, tier 3 low priority. We didn't think it was appropriate to categorize based on priority, because if you adopt these are all priorities of the board. So how we categorized was we looked at what level of intervention are we going to require in order to communicate and move these recommendations through the legislature. We identified a category 1 where we would turn to board members and the commissioner to communicate with legislators to advocate for these priorities. A category 2 at which that intervention would be more appropriate at the commissioner and assistant commissioner level. And then a category 3 where it's really the programmatic staff that would be most appropriate. And that would largely be technical cleanup matters. In category 1, we have 4 here, but there's actually a 5th that did not end up on the slide, unfortunately. That's our recommendation on coordinating expansion of higher education, our oversight role for career schools and colleges, our recommendations for Texas Grant and for the TEOG program, and then included in the should be outcomes-based funding for universities. That's been a priority of the board for some time. I'm going to go through primarily the category 1 recommendations, but certainly I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on any recommendation at all. In regards to the first recommendation, this is our recommendation that the coordinating board have authority to review and approve new off-campus academic and research sites. Specifically, this recommendation would let the coordinating board engage in negotiated rulemaking to define what an off-campus site is. So we would use that, work with stakeholders to define what do we mean when we're talking about off-campus sites. Then we would seek a statutory change that would require institutions to come to the coordinating board prior to acquiring property, and we would review and approve this new off-campus or expanded off-campus academic, technical, or research site. So this would put at the front end of the process a coordinating board review and approval of institutions opening new off-campus sites. The coordinating board review would be specifically to determine whether the new site would lead to unnecessary duplication in things like program offerings, faculties, and physical plants. And then we would work with institutions, again, through negotiated rulemaking to specify the precise criteria that would be reviewed.
John, I had a meeting last week, which I told you about, and is this simply prospective? Say, an institution acquired a site. Is what you're asking for is, well, once they acquired the site, hey, then this change, if legislature adopted it, that would take us out, it's already a done deal.
The requirement here would be that they would have to come to us prior to acquiring the site.
If they've already acquired the site.
Oh, I understand what you're saying.
In other words, okay, so we're looking back, well, that's water under the bridge. Therefore, we're not asking for any other oversight after they've acquired a site.
What we have proposed here would not apply to off-campus sites that have already been acquired.
I think I know what you're getting at. So once you do this, they would still need to, if they were to offer a degree program, they would still need to seek coordinating board approval. But it would be so that an institution wouldn't be acquiring and making a large investment in an area where there might be concerns about duplication, and then coming back, well, we've spent, $100 million, $500 million on this, and so why would you turn us down at this point because we have this investment? So it's to really be able to address the coordination part of the board's authority, not to determine what kind of buildings they build. We're not talking about facilities at all, but location. This gets at the crux of your need to coordinate. But still, you'd have retain the authority to approve programs as you do now later. You wouldn't have the problem of not having known they were going to this area before and them saying it's fait accompli, we're here, it's done. That makes it very difficult for you to make a decision.
So they, institution could, having acquired a site, and they could build a couple of buildings, and then they come to us telling us what they want to do with it. And at that point, we would have degree program granting authority.
Well, no, I think you would ask for what purpose. If you look at the fuller language, it's not just academic, it's research. What's the purpose of the location? And I think that would be part of, if we get this, we'd have to define the rules regarding what you would look at, but I think all these things you're talking about would be addressed. Is the intent at some point for degree granting? Is it for research? Is it a primate colony? What's the purpose?
I might be able to address this a little more in terms of another aspect of this. So what we're recommending here under the legislative recommendation is regarding essentially geographic expansion. It's regarding an institution acquiring property or expanding an existing off-campus site. The concern the board had was, well, what about new major programs? Things like the new medical schools that might not be in a new place geographically, but is a new major program that an institution could commit a lot of resources to and only then come to the board to notify us about it. What we're actually recommending to address that is there's going to be a conversation at the cause committee regarding a potential rule. And that rule would revolve around our planning authority. Currently in statute, institutions are required to notify us when they begin planning for a program, but we've never particularly defined what that means. So we're going to look at a rule that would require, specifically for professional programs, that we would have to be notified of planning at least a year before a program is submitted to the board.
Let me clarify in terms of the location. We're not talking about doing that only in the case of something like a medical school. Mm-hmm. It would be
Yes.
any location. So I just want to clarify that. And the location would require legislation. What John just spoke about, we can do by rule.
And that addresses my concern. We just need to have a seat at the table early, rather than after billions have been spent.
And that was exactly the focus of this, was making sure that your input is provided well before the train has gotten out of the station.
So is this applicable only to new locations, not an existing campus?
It would apply to an expansion at an off-campus location. So if a school is looking to expand an existing off-campus location, they would have to come to us before they could acquire any property.
Although I have to say, John, if we're going to use negotiated rulemaking to determine off-campus, that would probably be included as part of that discussion.
So it doesn't address the on-campus expansion?
It would not address any facility that they're looking to build on their existing campuses.
Well, a facility intended to grant a new degree that they had not received authority for.
Well, and I think the way that that would be addressed would be through the requirement that if they're going to offer that new major degree program, particularly professional programs, they have to let us know of that plan a year before they submit their program application.
So I
We
guess,
can do that in our rulemaking?
Currently, we have statutory authority to require that they notify us when they begin planning, and so this would be through rulemaking to define that process.
I guess a preview. So part of the thought in terms of the rule is that specifically for professional degrees as identified by statute, so MDs, DOs, JDs, Bachelor's of Laws, vets, that they have to notify you a year before they can submit a proposal, and that they would be required to come to the board at the immediately following meeting to share with you what they're wanting to do, and then you could provide them feedback before they present the proposal. As it is now, people can notify us, but it can be very late in the process, and this is really to address some of the concerns that came up at the last board meeting. We got together afterwards and said this would be a way to make sure that you were aware of these plans in a formal kind of way for degree programs that typically require a larger infrastructure around them. And most programs do not in that kind of way, but clearly those professional degrees do.
So I'm going to look at general counsel, how we might construct this. I do agree with the principle of accepting from public disclosure any plans, because obviously we've heard testimony in the past, some of the institutions were concerned that they might lose their strategic negotiating advantage on a certain property or a certain price. How are we going to accept from public disclosure and still stay consistent with the Open Meetings Act provisions of the state?
Well, this, excuse me, this would be new legislation, and in the legislation that we have currently drafted, it accepts it from public disclosure, both through a Public Information Act request, as well as when an institution wants to discuss the acquisition of property at an off-campus location with the board, seeking the board's approval to either acquire that property or to construct a new facility on its already existing off-campus site. And so as a result, if this legislation is enacted, it would create exceptions to both the Open Meeting Act as well as the Public Information Act.
So we would discuss, debate, and approve or disapprove in an executive session?
We would not take a vote in executive session. The discussion itself, however, would take place in executive session, and then the motion and the vote would take place in open session.
And I think it's important to add, and I don't know the details of how we did this, but when we had facilities approval, land acquisition, that there were instances in which the coordinating board was involved without it becoming public. It wasn't voted on at the time, but the people were aware that that something was going to happen in a general geographic area. In the past, I'm not sure how that was handled, but there was no approval involved at that point.
The approval would be simple. It would be for example, the University of X's proposed acquisition of property as set out in its request to the coordinating board is hereby approved. Motion, second, vote. And the proposal to the coordinating board would not be made public until after the transaction is effectuated, presuming it is, and the open meeting the discussion would not have occurred during the portion of the open meeting, rather it would have gone into a closed session, again assuming the proposed legislation is enacted.
I've got a question. If you
Yes,
have
sir.
an executive committee, this discussion, then you come to the open committee and say, this acquisition of this property is approved, won't it start curiosity and the things will get leaked out?
it could easily start discussion.
Can
Whether
you
or
not
not it would
approve
get-
it in the executive committee instead of open committee?
It's going to be pretty hard to cloak that in public. I'm just thinking about this, and I don't know how you do that. Item Alpha Bravo 1, 2, 3.
That's essentially what I envision. Not necessarily those numbers and letters, but essentially that's what I would envision with this. But you're right. I mean, there could still, discussion could be provoked, and I'm sure there would be.
We're going to have to blind the institution and the location. People will figure it out. Even calling it the University of blank implies that there's a whole lot of other institutions that are not involved, and it narrows that down. I'm just saying, we got to think about that as we try to work with the legislature on this.
Okay.
Were there any other questions or points on this recommendation? Our second Category 1 recommendation is regarding oversight of career schools and colleges. This is a repeat of a recommendation that we had during the last session. We would strengthen our authority, our oversight authority on these institutions, specifically requiring compliance with accrediting bodies and federal financial rules, as well as our ability to revoke their certificate of authorization for cause. Another element of this is that we're recommending that the coordinating board be designated as the agency to establish a repository of student records for closed career schools. Currently, when a career college goes out of business, you can end up with just a warehouse full of student records. What we would recommend is that the coordinating board be allowed to establish this repository and set the means by which career colleges would provide us their records. There is some funding implication to that, so we would request additional funding from the legislature to be able to implement that.
John, the funding would come from the legislature?
That is the recommendation. The last time we did this, we actually had a bill that was passed, but Governor Abbott vetoed that legislation. And his concern was that we were funding it through a fee structure. And his concern was that those fees would end up being passed on to students through higher tuition. So this time we're recommending, instead of a fee structure, seeking general revenue from the legislature.
We couldn't have a bonding process?
I don't know that we've explored that. A bond that the institution would.
The institution would place a bond based upon getting a certificate of authority, and if they went belly up, that the bond would then pay for the warehouse of those records.
I do know a concern that's been raised in the past has been that, I guess currently, career schools are subject to some federal requirements in that regard, and that having the state also require that they post a bond would be almost double dipping, but would also put a level of compliance costs on the career schools that they weren't, that they thought would be burdensome.
This issue has become more urgent in the past month or so. The accrediting agency for these for-profit schools has come under fire, and a federal agency has recommended the elimination of this accrediting agency, which would place more of a burden, at least in the short run, on states to oversee these career for-profit schools that have been getting into so much trouble lately. So I think the environment is deteriorated even more since we started talking about this recommendation as a priority for the board.
Our next two recommendations are regarding financial aid programs, and to provide a little context to these recommendations, the feedback that the commissioner has been getting from the legislature, pretty much the entire interim, has been that the budget is going to be very tight, and that there's not going to be a lot of additional funding available for things that the legislature might value. So the commissioner's focus has been, particularly with financial aid, let's make sure that we're using these dollars as effectively as possible to achieve our goals. So in that context, we have several recommendations relating to Texas grant. We're recommending limiting the total number of hours a recipient may receive the grant to 135 or 15 beyond your degree requirements. Currently, a student can receive Texas grant lifetime for 150 semester credit hours. So this would both encourage the student to complete their education in a more timely manner, and it would also free up those dollars that are currently going to students between 135 and 150 hours to be reinvested in the Texas grant program. We're also recommending that students complete 30 semester credit hours a year in Texas grant, and that they be allowed to do so through any combination of fall, spring, and summer sessions, so that if 15-15 doesn't work for you, you can do a 12-12 and 6. We have a recommendation that the grant award be limited to the cost of tuition, fees, and a book stipend, less any Pell assistance that the student receives. The idea behind this is that it will allow us to accommodate more students who have very significant need but are not the neediest, but it will still ensure that students have their cost of attendance covered through a combination of federal and state assistance. And then the final recommendation is currently institutions are required to provide, if a student does not receive a Texas grant to cover their tuition and fees, the institution is required to basically fill up that gap with institutional funds, or fill in that gap with institutional funds. This recommendation would be that for students who are beyond the priority EFC level, that requirement be waived, so that institutions could make potentially smaller grants to more students in this category. Were there any questions on that recommendation? And then very similarly for TEOG, which is our program for our 2-year institutions, we have some recommendations. We're also recommending that we accommodate more families by limiting grant award amounts to tuition, fees, and books, less Pell. We're recommending expanding the number of semester credit hours that a community college baccalaureate student may receive the grant. Currently, for those 3 community colleges that offer baccalaureates, a student can only receive TEOG for 75 hours. So to match this up with our Texas grant recommendation, we would allow those students to receive TEOG for 135 hours. And then finally, we would clarify statute to allow institutions discretion to continue TEOG if the student has a hardship. It's not here, but one thing to make you aware of, we actually had a meeting with TEOG stakeholders yesterday, and this was regarding an issue that's come up in light of our exceptional item requests. When we were looking at our exceptional item requests for TEOG, one of the concerns that the commissioner expressed was if we're going to request additional funding for TEOG, we have to ensure that we're going to get better outcomes for that funding. Particularly if you look at the TEOG completion rates for TEOG students at community colleges, the 2-year associate and certificate graduate rate is about 5.6%. If you take that out to 3 years, it goes up to about 10.4%. So the commissioner's concern was, what can we do to make sure that these students are having more success in getting to their degrees? So what the staff came up with was a recommendation that we would require TEOG recipients to participate in a student success initiative at their campus, so that each semester, in order to continue to be eligible for TEOG, you would have to be certified by the institution as having participated in a student success initiative. Those are things like tutoring, academic interventions, et cetera. So to make sure that those students are on the right path. We would exempt students who have a 3.0 or higher from that requirement, because obviously they are on the right path and they are having success. What we're discussing right now is that as part of our exceptional item requests, requesting additional TEOG funding, but then also requesting funding specifically for student success initiatives that would go to the community colleges to help them support their student success initiatives. So that's something that, again, we're not requesting anything or any approval from you now, but when we come back in July in the context of our exceptional item requests, we may be looking for approval of that. And then the final category 1 recommendation we have is regarding outcomes-based funding. At the April board meeting, you did adopt the formula funding recommendations, which included for universities the graduation bonus. So that would award $500 per undergraduate degree, and $1,000 per undergraduate degree to at-risk students to universities. So this would hopefully incent them to increase their number of graduates and particularly focus on those at-risk graduates who can be more expensive to get to degree. And we're also recommending increased funding for community college success points. We're recommending taking up the per success point amount to $215 per success point, so that community colleges would receive even a greater financial reward for helping their students have success. Those are the category 1s. In the interest of your time, I'll stop there, although I'm happy to answer any questions about any of these.
David?
Yeah, during the Nacogdoches regional meeting, several of the educators made me aware that our policy is to give formula funding based upon enrollment on the 12th day of class. And that if the student drops, it will be past the 12th day, the institution gets full funding for that student being in class for the full semester, but no penalty. Obviously, there's some professors that have high drop rates. There's no financial incentive for the institution to correct that behavior and to incentivize its faculty to not have high drop rates. And yet the student is then tagged with the hours. And if you have a maximum of 135 or 140, whatever that number is, hours, the student unfairly then has not really taken the class. The state spent the money. The student doesn't get the education, and then they're ineligible for further funding if they exceed that beyond that. It seems to me that we need to move that goalpost past the 12th day to the drop day. And let's look at the real numbers of who's actually enrolled in the class that's actually taking the class, or divide the money up into 4 monthly increments, so that the 12th day, the 42nd day, the 72nd day. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Because I think it's unfair for us to tag the student with the hours as if they took the class. It's unfair for the taxpayers to pay for an empty seat. I understand the institutions say, well, but I can't oversubscribe my classroom and I've got empty seats. Well, get your professors to not have people drop.
The commissioner may have some input on this one, but actually,
I liked how you took that hot potato and threw it over here.
we actually did have a
I didn't have a very good answer, but I have some ideas on this. But it seems that we're treating the taxpayers and the students unfairly.
Sounds like our very first outcomes-based funding recommendation years ago.
I was going to
which
say,
we can
it
talk
was
about.
before my time, but our initial attempt at an outcomes-based funding recommendation was
Was to
simply
fund
to
on
say,
completed hours, not attempted hours.
yes. And that was not particularly well received.
Because the institutions kept the money and the students kept the debt,
Yeah.
was a phrase.
Right. So how are we going to rectify that defect if we're asking for a lower semester hour to be funded, and yet we're keeping the same incentive systems for the institutions to just check the number of classroom attendees on the 12th day? That doesn't make much sense to me. If we're going to incentivize folks, everybody should be parallel incentives, which means the institutions have got to be parallel as well.
Well, in success points and with the proposed model that was just mentioned, there is an incentive for them, for the students to graduate. And it doesn't get into, is it 4 years, 6 years? You want them to graduate. If they've been out of school 2 years, you want to get them back and graduated, because you will actually receive money to do that. And that hasn't been there. And it's a very straightforward system. It doesn't have, many of our previous recommendations have had so many factors that people wanted to include, taking into account every possible correction. They weren't very clear. This one, I think, after a meeting or two, the Formula Funding Committee was very receptive to this because it was clear cut and it identified clearly the students to work with. It wouldn't preclude what you're talking about from happening entirely, but there clearly is a strong incentive in this proposal.
So do we have to have something in statute to change the attendance on the 12th day, or is that something that we can change in the way that we fund?
I think that would require statutory change. Statutory, right? Yeah.
Well, I can tell you that you're not going to have success if the student needs a grant and they've got 135 hours, of which 12 are dropped classes, and they need to get those additional hours and they can't afford to go. So they're going to be just short of the goal line, and we have to align the incentives, the institutions, the taxpayers, and the students. And the way we're accounting, I say don't count the hours against the student.
Don't for Texas grant.
If they drop, don't count that toward their maximum hours of funding.
Well, there is another cultural aspect you need to be aware of I think everybody has to be responsible, but we have a culture that's emerged over the years in which students are much more likely to drop courses for reasons that you wouldn't imagine. So that there will be students who take a class because they're made a C and they want to make a B. There are students who will make a B and they want to make an A. And so some of these things went into the creation of this in terms of the student responsibility. Part of this is students wanting to take additional courses without a mind towards what's it going to cost overall. One thing that the committee Linda mentioned earlier will address in terms of financial literacy and the app and all that is, what are the consequences of you taking an extra course? What are the consequences of you taking a course that isn't really required and takes you beyond the hours? So they can get an idea of, you're going to be incurring either dollars straight out of your pocket now or increasing your debt. So there are a lot of these things that come together. I mean, there's a need for everyone to be responsible here, the institution, the student, and the culture is very different from when most of us were in school. When I was in school, nobody would take a course over if they didn't have to. They just wanted to graduate and get out. And there was not as much pressure on grade points then as there is now. And so all these things come together to make sort of a less efficient process and a more costly process than it should be. So what you're talking about is a real problem. I know that.
Well, I mean, and there's other aspects to this too. When you have a professor unknown to the enrollees in the class who has a history of huge drops, teaches and doesn't test from what they taught, and you get to the drop date and the person who's setting the curve has a C minus and half the class drops, and that happens semester after semester after semester, who's going to correct the faculty on that?
Yeah.
And the other is that, we have this a la carte menu. Why should I pay for anything more than just a one-time fee for being a full-time student and take as many classes as I think I can take?
Yeah. Now,
That's part of the problem.
there is I believe it was Odessa College, actually came to the board, in recognition of excellence. Was it Odessa or was it Midland, Rex? Who talked about how they worked with faculty to advise them and work with them in terms of the impact of dropped courses, and actually identified faculty who had excess dropped courses and worked with them to help them understand the impact of that, and they had led to a large reduction. Now, when we had the first process Raymond wanted in terms of paying on completion, one institution reported to us they actually had 57,000 fewer dropped courses in 1 year. Why? Because, they put resources into advising the students in terms of the impact. And sometimes it's better for students to make that C minus and move on than to drop it and come back. We talk about debt as well. If you think about that, we know psychology majors directly out of school, a job's likely to pay about $25,000 a year. Somebody has to advise them that if they take 6 years to graduate, that's $50,000 they've lost. And so there are a lot of things that go into creating a culture where people better understand the impact of all their decisions, which of course is a great marketable skill in itself. So I'm just, I don't, what you're raising is an important point, and how to do it, I think it would be difficult at this late point because we haven't discussed this with the institutions.
So I'll move approval of the
Legislative agenda.
staff legislative recommendations and the priorities, or categories, not priorities.
Second? Stewart, have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much.
Chairman, I would just make a note on that if the staff could go back and just add the one that's missing from this.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, we'll provide that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, move the top on category 2 to the bottom of category 1. Is that it?
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay, we're going to now take a break for lunch. While we'll have a quorum possibly present, no public business or policy will be discussed over lunch at that time. And we intend to reconvene in 25 minutes. We'll do that when we come back to reconvene, and then we'll adjourn the board meeting. We'll make that appointment, and then immediately go to the cause.
12:50,
How long do you think?
20 minutes, 12:45.
12:50. Let's go till then.
Some of us are.
We don't need you for the cause.
It's an important point,
We've got a quorum.
They're gonna say, you want this, but you have to. They're gonna say yes, but you didn't. You see what I mean?
we actually like that.
Yeah, it's worth trying, because I think that would be the one that most of us would feel. I'm going to call us back to order from recess from lunch. I'm going to make a temporary appointment to the Cause Committee. We have 2 members that we're going to appoint temporarily. We have several members who cannot make the meeting today, so I'm exercising my authority pursuant to Section 61.026 of the Texas Education Code to appoint Dr. David Tischer and myself as members of this committee for today's meeting in order to ensure that we have a quorum for the committee. This concludes our special called board meeting. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Move. Second? Second. All in favor, aye? Aye. Thank you. The motion passes and we stand adjourned. I'll turn it to you, Janelle.
All right, welcome to everyone. We're glad you're here. This is the Committee on Academic and Workforce Success. Please be advised, we are on the internet being broadcast internationally, I'm sure. So reminder about your phones and making any untoward noises. Agenda item 2 is consideration of approval of the minutes from the March 30th